I'm back here in the garage at Adam's Speed Shop, which means we have more parts. And for this particular episode, we're going to work with a bunch of recovery equipment. I spent the last weekend here up in the snow with a number of Jeeps and quite a few other people that decided to jump out and get into the fresh snow, and recovery is a big issue. We actually had a pretty heavy delay getting out because of the number of vehicles that got stuck, and we actually jumped out with the group of people that we had and helped out in pulling at least 5 vehicles out of the end of the trail over at Deep Creek just to get out and home that day. There was a pretty good 3.5-4 hour delay, so what time better than now to get all of the recovery gear in place. And as the vehicle is equipped to handle the Warn 9.5 XP winch, we are going to go ahead and use that to install in the front bumper area. We'll see the full teardown on that. One of the other things we will be putting in with it is the wireless winch controller. This is a product that Warren has put out that allows you to use the app on your phone so that you can stand out in front of the vehicle and operate all of the functionality without a wired remote. AEV has put the hook isolator as well, so this will help protect the billet component that comes in the winch install kit that is specifically made by AEV for the front bumper on the Bison. So we'll take a closer look and open up the parts and see what's inside and see how everything goes together on the truck. Here's what you get with the AEV installation kit, and this is for the ZR2 Bison package, which is different than the standard ZR2. Obviously, the biggest differences are we have the accommodation for the fair lead here. This is the big dollar product. This is one piece of cast componentry here. That is a heavy chunk of metal. We are looking at the complete wiring harness, and this is to relocate the solenoid for the Warn Winch 9.5 XS. That is the bracket, and this is the important part that mounts, and we'll talk about what's got to change in particular on my application and something to be warned about with other applications. This particular hole mounts to the fender area where the factory airbox lower mount bolt is, and I have an S&B aftermarket, and we've discovered that that might be an issue. These two are up on the firewall. There is no cutting or drilling. This is very much so a bolted installation. And then, of course, this is our product list with all the hardware. So definitely going through this right now. I'll be going to AEVconversions.com for the installation guide and walking you through all the things that are involved with that. So here's all the parts in the box and getting ready to do the install. So here we are under the hood, and this is where we come to discover, if you notice, I don't have the complete cold air intake on there. It is missing the air box, and as we've come to discover, the air box does interfere with the particular installation of this product, so that's something to be forewarned about. I'm not sure if I'm going to look at modifying this. We will talk about what we can do as an option, but let's take a look at what we're looking at with interference. So the factory S&B the factory and the S&B airbox both utilize these two studs at the bottom here for mounting. You'll see those two right there and right there. Both of those are occupied by the airbox, and in the S&B they're actually inside the airbox, which prohibits the bracket from mounting. So when we come over here and grab our bracket, you'll see how this sits in place. And before we even got started, we read through the instructions to see what exactly is involved. As we go to place this bracket in its home, you'll see that it does use that mounting hole. And you can see the other two bolt holes here that we'll have to get those aligned. But the proximity here to the bracket and the airbox is what we're looking at as being a problem. The S&B airbox literally sits to about halfway over this. So I'm not sure that that's something I can relocate, but I am going to look at what I have to do to make sure that that can be accommodated, or if in fact it's an exclusion in getting this one done. So just going through the instructions is an important step. Make sure you read through them before you get in there so you can figure out if you have any issues. In this case here, I'm going to be installing the factory airbox again just to avoid anything with regards to this install, and then figuring out how I have to work in another aftermarket air intake such as the S&B. One of the unique parts of the Colorado ZR2 Bison is all of the underbody protection. All of those boron steel skids provide great protection on the bottom. However, to get where we need to go today to install the winch, we're going to have to remove quite a few of them. At the front, we're going to start with the front fair lead area, and there's 6 bolts here, 2 in the license plate area, 2 on the bottom, and don't forget the 2 on the sides. This area has to come off. It is part of the mounting winch area, as well as it does expose the front bumper midsection. We do have to remove this to get the air diverter out, which we'll see a little bit later. There are 6 torque bolts here. These will all come out the same size. And once you get that off, just set aside the center section and we can get started on the main skid below. The main skid has a total of 8 bolts. The 2 at the very front are in holes that are not slotted. Those are usually the first 2 that I pull off. The remaining 6 all have slots, and depending upon how yours lines up on the truck, you may have to remove all of them or leave a couple in, is usually what I do, so that I can suspend the weight on the bolt heads, get myself positioned from underneath it, and then gently set the skid down so it doesn't come crashing down on my fingers or the other pile of bolts. Once you have that skid removed, you can move on to taking out the closeouts. To remove the passenger side closeout, there are at least 6 Torx head style screws that you're going to have to remove. There are 2 in the very front, 2 on the side, and 2 on the inner fender well. There's a few more that you can remove to loosen up the inner fender liner. That just makes it easier to remove the entire closeout when it comes time for that. Don't forget there's also one 10mm bolt that's sort of hidden in front of the sway bar. With the bolt and all the screws removed, you should be able to wiggle out the closeout and set it aside. The reason why we're removing the closeout is so that we can gain access to the area where the wires run from the winch all the way to the remote solenoid. Without removing the panel, it's nearly impossible, and there's also one more bolt that we have to gain access to for the remote solenoid bracket mount. Next, we have to remove the plastic air diverter. This is held in place with 12 of the push-pin style locking retainers, and you'll have to remove the center section and the retainer body to pull out the air diverter. This diverter is put in place just behind the center section of the bumper. Once the retaining pins are all pulled out, we can remove the air diverter and take a look at the bottom. GM has provided an emboss in the bottom of the plastic that shows us the area that we need to trim for the window. I've chosen to use the Dremel as my tool, but you can use whatever cutting tool you want. Just make sure you clean up the area as it will be exposed and visible from outside the vehicle. After removing the new solenoid from the box, quick inspection shows that the lead lengths are obviously not going to meet our needs for where our location of our solenoid is going to be. With the AEV kit, we're provided with new longer leads that'll give us the proper location and length, but what we're going to have to do is open up the box to get to those lugs, loosen the lugs, and remove the wires from the solenoid. It should be noted that the wires are going to be fairly stiff as they are brand new. There's also a wire separator which holds them in place that keeps it fairly stiff. I found that loosening the 4 little tabs and taking the wire separator off allowed for a very quick and easy removal, making sure that I don't damage anything while putting in the new wiring or taking out the old. With the heavy gauge wire removed, we now need to address the motor ground. This needs to be shortened and the AEV extension added. For now, we're going to go ahead and remove that wire and strip it back to allow for the wire to be connected. At this point in time, I found it easier to pick the larger wires, making note of the appropriate locations on the solenoid and the markings on the wire to place them in the correct location. Feeding each one through the wire separator and then pushing the separator in with the heaviest positive battery terminal going in last provided me the easiest possible installation. Making sure that each of the lugs on the appropriate location, tighten down each of the lugs with the appropriate nut, and then feed through the extension ground wire from the AEV harness. This should already have a shrink connector on it, and this will be inserted, crimped, and shrunk down and then put inside the solenoid box. Next, we're going to have to put the winch into its final location so we can route the wires and zip tie them out of the way of any moving parts. Carefully raise the winch into its new location using the 4-inch bolts provided by AEV's new kit and the factory nut hardware provided by Warren. It should be noted that the 4-inch bolts will be used to get the location correct on the top of the winch. With the top 2 bolts in place, the lower bolts can be installed and the winch adjusted to its final location. The bottom 2 bolts will be tightened to their final torque spec, while the top 2 will be removed again so that we can install the fairlead block. Once the fairlead block is in, we'll reinstall the 2 4-inch bolts temporarily again until we get the center load tube bumper insert back in place for its final installation. And here's a quick checkup on what you should see. You'll have your ground in the 3 lugs on the back of the motor side, the spool, and of course our clutch, and this is the location it should be in if it's properly installed. Moving back to the engine compartment, we need to finalize our solenoid mount. So we're going to use the AEV to provide a bracket, push the lower bolt hole through the fender, and then line up the 2 core support bolts. Once we have all the bolts loosely placed into their proper holes, we'll go ahead and tighten them down to torque spec, and then place the solenoid, dropping the wires straight down so we can access them from the bottom and wire them up to the motor assembly. And before you finish the closeouts, don't forget you have to crawl underneath here, pull back the inner fender, and hit the last bolt. Working the wires down along the side of the radiator, you're going to find a small place between the radiator and the frame where all 4 wires should fit with no problem. The AEV extension wire harness will travel along the bottom of the radiator support all the way to the motor assembly, where you'll find the 3 terminals and your ground. Be careful to look at the diagram to make sure that you put the appropriate color-coded wire to the appropriate lug. When you're finished, this is what it should look like. The Warn 9.5 XPS is equipped with synthetic rope. This rope does have an eyelet at the end that has a retainer that must be bolted to the side of the spool. The kit provides you with some blue thread locker, as that is also necessary to ensure that it doesn't vibrate loose. You're working in pretty tight quarters, and the rope isn't very forgiving as it's brand new. Take your time and make sure that the rope is pinched correctly and you do not cross-thread the bolt as you're threading it into the spool. With all of our wiring complete and the winch in its final position, we're ready to give power to the solenoid. Our positive battery terminal lead will travel around the front of the core support, down around the side of the battery, up on top to the fuse block assembly. Here, we're going to have to notch the side of the fuse block so that we can get the battery terminal lead in with the cap closed. Once we're there, we're going to connect to the battery side of the terminal of the 300 amp fuse. Having double checked our wiring, we're ready to connect the ground. This will be the final portion of our electrical install. Here we can remove the negative accessory battery terminal nut, add the winch negative, and retighten in the factory location. So here's the finished view of the solenoid in its remote mount with the AEV relocation kit. You can see the loom wire here across the front of the core support is the main power feed, and of course everything just taps into the battery. I have made a small alteration here, and if you see the battery has been shifted forward, and that was just so that I had enough space to put the cable in without extending the cable, and keeping everything a little bit more tucked here against the side of the front of the core support and the firewall. Other than that, ground cable in the same spot, power cable is notched into the side of the pack there. You can see that for the cable access, and it of course is on the battery lead side of the terminal, not on the other side of the fuse link for the 300 amp fuse. But overall, pretty impressed with how the routing works. Everything is super clean. I do have to wrap up a little bit more underneath the actual solenoid. As you can see down here, there's the final mounting position. Sorry about the light there. But the cabling runs just parallel to the side of the radiator, and some of the cables, as you can see right now, are out and about. I am going to zip tie those back together and have them follow the edge of the radiator. Now that we're all powered up and we don't have any dead shorts, means we can test the system out and of course feed in our synthetic line. Here I'm going to use a glove to make sure I don't cut myself as I'm feeding the line from side to side, evenly distributing the synthetic line across the spool. It appears that everything seems to be running very well, and the power system seems to be running without fail. I've got no shorts, no fuses blowing, so I'm pretty happy with the setup. With the line fed in, it's time to put the AEV isolator on so I don't damage the fair lead, and of course install the Warn winch hook. And here's a quick view of everything before we button it all up. So I'm just getting started with the reassembly of the original bumper that's equipped with the Bison. As you can see that behind me, it is an accent color to the front of the grille. And when I first got the truck, I thought it kind of stood out and a little bit maybe too much. I don't know if it was maybe the color of the vehicle and the kind of anthracite kind of mattish color that the rest of the bumper was. So I ordered the low tube bumper, but I will say over time the accent color has grown on me. But today, you'll see here's what it looked like, and with the winch assembly in there, just nice and neatly tucked aside. I do have the AEV low bumper, which I'm looking at going ahead and put this on as I originally intended, but I don't know. I've come to like the different accent color that's been on the front, so we'll see. Maybe the low tube bumper might be a little bit too much on the anthracite black. It might just finish it off, but I guess we're going to find out. So there's the finished product, and I think I am going to like that low bar. The bull bar kind of push component looks a little tougher. The overall all black aesthetic, or that anthracite look, is definitely, I think, the original look I liked, and definitely agreeing with the fact that this was the right decision to go. But I still think one of the best parts is how well integrated the winch is between Warren on the 9.5 XPS and the guys over at AEV doing the integration and working with GM on this. You really can't tell it's even there apart from the hook at the end. So take a closer look. The biggest part about this design and this hitch particular use and really making this bumper was the airflow. And as you can see, that direct shot with the diverter. The only modification we had to make here is so that we can see the lead line as it's being spooled inside. Little preview window there that we had to cut out. All the provisions were made by GM in the original part to make that cutout, so it comes out nice and neat. But again, it's a small little add-on to the front, but it does make a big difference in the ability for us to get out where we want to be and make sure we don't get stuck. So again, really enjoying the fact that this was a two-part install with the low bar bumper from AEV, but really all the credit to them in designing the bumper in the first place to fit that winch in a way that really completely doesn't take away from the front end of the truck. So good job, guys. Can't wait for the next mod.